And we're finally here. I want to start by thanking a Reddit user called Tower Walker, who provided the Japanese to English translations that I'm using throughout this episode, and of course I'll be using these translations in future episodes as well. At the suggestion of a commenter called Mephistopheia, I have added a link to a paste bin where I'm putting all of these translations, so if you're interested you can have a read. I would also like to thank the YouTube user Moonlight Butterfly, who has put together a channel of all of Bloodborne's dialogue without any ambient sound or music attached to it, which I have used in this video, and I mean, if you've played Bloodborne you'll know that a lot of Gehrman's dialogue in The Hunter's Dream, no one really seems to understand what triggers him to say it, so having it all archived there was extremely helpful. So, let's go. So we've had 2 episodes that have basically been Lovecraft-free, and in contrast to those, this episode's going to be extremely Lovecraft-heavy, specifically referencing a series of linked stories he wrote, which are called the Dream Cycle. And it's, I think, important to get down kind of mechanically how dreams work in Lovecraft's Dream Cycle, because from some of the stuff I've seen, I get the impression that people think that the dreams in Bloodborne kind of work like Inception, as if we're somehow inside of dreams that Micolash and Gehrman are having. This is not how dreams and dreaming work in Lovecraft's fiction. Bloodborne is not a Lovecraft game, per se. It's a game that has one foot in Lovecraft and has used Lovecraft as a jumping-off point in the same way that Demon Souls and Dark Souls used a sort of a Nordic-inflected high fantasy as a jumping-off point. So there really isn't a kind of one-to-one relationship between Bloodborne and Lovecraft where you can look at Lovecraft and it will explain how Bloodborne works and vice versa. However, the way they present dreaming is largely consistent, so I'm going to go use Lovecraft's explanation and apply that to Bloodborne. The best way to describe Lovecraft's dreamlands using kind of standard SF terminology is that they're a parallel universe, and that human consciousnesses can travel there while dreaming. If you want a kind of functional but not very good analogy, it's kind of like the Matrix, where nothing happens to your body, but your consciousness is projected into this other world. And it's also possible, although extremely difficult, to enter the dreamlands physically. Through, we'll just call it a portal. Sorry, it's just that like Lovecraft fans listening will probably be really furious that I'm reducing his ideas to these sort of sci-fi cliches. Like it's a dimensional portal to a parallel world. The point is that the player and Gehrman and Micolash and the hunters that we meet in the Nightmare Frontier and anyone else we happen to run into in the Dreamlands is someone who has found their way to this other world. And if we all left, it would stay there. This raises the fairly obvious question, though, of, well, if this is an independent place, why does it look exactly like the abandoned workshop? Well, there is an answer to that in The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, in a scene where the narrator meets a character called King Kuranes. Kuranes is a very old man whose physical body has decayed. He was a homeless old alcoholic, but his consciousness has survived in the Dreamlands. And basically because he has dreamed for so long, he has become powerful enough to affect the world around him. That's why he's called King Kuranes. And what he does with his powers is, he uses them to create a kind of idealized facsimile of the village he grew up in. Basically because those are his only happy memories. He could not go back to these things in the waking world, because his body was dead, but he had done the next best thing and dreamed a small tract of such countryside in the region east of the city, where meadows rolled gracefully up from sea cliffs to the foot of the Tenarian hills. There he dwelt in a grey Gothic manor house of stone looking on the sea, and tried to think it was ancient Trevor Towers, where he was born, and where 13 generations of his forefathers had first seen the light. And in a valley not far off he had reared a great Norman abbey, whose tower he could see from his window, placing around it in the churchyard grey stones with the names of his ancestors carved thereon, and with a moss somewhat like Old England's moss. For though Kuranes was monarch in the land of dream, with all imagined pomps and marvels, splendours and beauties, ecstasies and delights, novelties and excitements at his command, he would gladly have resigned forever the whole of his power and luxury and freedom for one blessed day as a simple boy in that pure and quiet England. So I do see a lot of similarity between Gurman and Kuraness. They're both lonely, melancholy old men who live in a world that's made out of their own happy memories. Gurman's badge is even described as having no practical purpose, except perhaps to assist in romanticising the past. So, while it's clear that the Hunter's Dream is based on the abandoned workshop, it's not clear whether this is a snapshot of what the workshop used to look like when Gurman was at his happiest, or whether it was kind of always a mess and Gurman is just remembering it with rose-tinted glasses. But it's also possible that the Moon Presence is the one that created the Hunter's Dream. We'll go into this later, but basically all signs point to the Moon Presence being summoned at the abandoned old workshop. And if that's true, then the Moon Presence may have just shaped this area of the Dreamlands to resemble the workshop because that's where it was summoned. Like if you have a pet lizard, you try to make the environment in the lizard's tank match as closely as possible the environment where that lizard would be found in the wild. So I'll do a side-by-side comparison here and just quickly reel off the differences. The Hunter's Dream is filled with headstones that are not present in the abandoned workshop, with the exception of the one we sometimes see the doll pray at. Basically every headstone model in the game is used here. I don't know if there's anything significant about them, although I would draw your attention to the final ritual altar. In one of Redgrave's Little Things in Yharnam videos, he talks about how the Hunter's Mark looked to him like the Hanged Man, the tarot card. My gut reaction there was that he was kind of stretching, but then you look at the final ritual altar, and that just is the Hanged Man. The leg is crossed in exactly the same way, so as far as I'm concerned, he's absolutely right. The break in the fence is present in both the workshop and the dream. In the dream it leads nowhere, but in the workshop it leads to the stairway that will take us to Cathedral Ward. Although interestingly, the gate that leads us to the area where we fight Gurman isn't present in the workshop. And there doesn't even seem to be ground there that would lead to the base of the tree. So it seems like the kind of graveyard area where we fight Gurman was an addition to the dream that's not present in the waking world, although the tree is present in both. You can actually see the base of the tree properly in the waking world if you head to the area just prior to Yahar'gul and use the monocular. The way the doll talks about it as the Great Tree makes it sound like it's significant, but there doesn't seem to be anything significant there at all. It's just the roots of the tree. But then having just talked about the Hanged Man, it makes me think, well, the Hanged Man is hanging from a tree. So maybe, this is the tree from which, the hunters or maybe just Gurman are kind of symbolically hanging. As for these odd poles in the distance, I have no idea what they're supposed to be. The problem with them is that you can see the top of them, so there's clearly nothing at the top. They just end. So, there's all kinds of theories that I've read that, at the top of each one of these is another workshop, or that these are the bottoms of the masts you see poking through the mist in the Nightmare Frontier. But, no, we can see the top, and they just have a blunt end to them. If I had to come up with some kind of explanation for them, I would say that either Gurman or the Moon Presence, or whatever it was that created the Hunter's Dream, has a kind of fleeting impression of Yharnam as a city of very tall towers, but it doesn't remember them in enough detail to actually dream them accurately. So we have a landscape that gives us the impression that we're surrounded by towers. That's very, very stretching it, though. I think they might just be weird. The most substantial differences, though, are actually inside the workshop. There's this message in the corner that tells us to halt the source of the spreading scourge of beasts. And what's really interesting about this message is that it's actually got a kind of unique graphic to it. There are two kinds of messages in Bloodborne. There's the normal ones that we're used to seeing, where the messengers pop out of the ground and give us a note. And then there are these ones that appear to just be something someone has written down, with a little kind of sparkle graphic on the top of it to draw our attention to it. The one in the dream actually uses both. It's the grey bubbling effect with a sparkle on it. And if you look closely at it, there's nothing there that this seems to be written on. There's no paper, there's no book, it's just there. So it looks like this is a direct communication from the messengers, except that it uses the sparkle overlay, which makes it look like this is supposed to be written somewhere. For all I know, it's a design oversight, but it is odd that it only shows up here. Maybe the developers just really, really want you to notice this message more than the others. I don't know. There have been a lot of theories around this statue, and before I get into them, I want to point out that the whole kind of back area of the workshop it's in a pretty dilapidated state in both the waking world and the dream. Like, the dream workshop has a nice fire going, and it's got a row of photographs, and it's got this little table where you can have tea. But the back part is still, it's very, very dingy, it's covered in cobwebs, and it doesn't really fit with the aesthetic that the rest of the Dream Workshop has going for it. There are candles lit, but it just looks like no one takes care of it. And when we meet Gurman inside the workshop, he's always facing away from it. So it's possible that this is like a bad memory for Gurman of what happened at the real workshop, and we'll get into that in a second, but I want to go back to the statue now. The thing about these statues to me is basically that they reek of cut content. If you remember the very, very, very first Bloodborne trailer, back when it was called Project Beast rather than Bloodborne, there was a very, very brief sequence of the main character shoving a kind of like a sword or a rod or something into one of these statues and light coming out of it. And you'll remember, of course, the ones in the Chalice dungeons have lanterns on them, which illuminate when we operate the lever. So my take on it has always been that in an earlier build of the game, these things were the lanterns that we respawn at. I mean, they've got lanterns on them, and it always made more sense to me that it would be this sort of goddess statue that you respawned at, because when you think about it, the way that we go to and from the dream via kind of gas lanterns that pop out of the ground, it doesn't really make any kind of aesthetic sense. Like, unless there's some Japanese cultural thing that I'm unaware of, I don't really get why a lantern that's come out of the ground that for some reason reaches our knee is connected to going into a dream. But if you imagine that we're instead, lighting a shrine of some kind, that kind of makes more sense. Particularly if there's one in the Hunter's Dream, because that's where you'd be returned to. I mean, this could all be completely wrong, obviously, but I just don't understand the lanterns. But the altar in front of the shrine, to me, is a lot more interesting. It's where, in the waking world, we find one of the third umbilical cords. The description of that cord reads as follows. Every great one loses its child, and then yearns for a surrogate. The third umbilical cord precipitated the encounter with the pale moon, which beckoned the hunters and conceived the hunter's dream. This ties in with a note we find in the second floor of the lecture building, which reads, The nameless moon presence beckoned by Lawrence and his associates. Pale blood. So it appears that Lawrence was at some point at the abandoned workshop and was able to summon the moon presence. As to the identity of his associates, it's safe to say one of them is Gurman, on the grounds that Gurman knows Lawrence, he's familiar with him, and you can hear Gurman muttering about Lawrence in his sleep. As for other associates, there are two other candidates I can think of, which would be whoever is buried at the headstone that we see the doll praying at, because that is there in the Waking World version of the workshop, and also possibly the beast that we find at the bottom of the shaft that the workshop is connected to, simply because it's very close to the workshop and it doesn't seem to be able to get in or out of the silo area that it's in. But yeah, back to the altar. Interestingly, it's positioned in such a way that moonlight coming in through the window at the top of the wall will shine directly onto the altar. So, if you were trying to get the attention of something that's related to the moon, this would be the perfect place to put it. I'm also interested in the blood that we see all over the altar in the Dream version. I've seen people suggest that the blood is there because we're using the Rune Workshop tool to brand the Carol runes into our brain, and that's causing blood to come out. But, I mean, as you'll recall, the Carol rune descriptions state that Provost Willem would have been proud of Carol's runes, as they do not rely upon blood in any measure. And also remember that the Rune Workshop tool's missing when we get there. So I think that the blood might actually be part of this sort of snapshot that was taken of the workshop when the dream was created. Because if you imagine, the moon presence looking in through that window, being lured by the umbilical cord, if that cord had just been removed from a body, there'd be blood everywhere. And again, if we look at the pre-patched description of that cord, we get extra information. one of the heirlooms used to contact the Great Ones, originating in the child of the Vilebloods. Now, whether or not this is canonical it's a real canon of worms, really, because it was cut out very deliberately, so maybe Miyazaki changed his mind. However, nothing in that description contradicts anything in the patched game. So I'm going to say that on the basis of it not being contradicted, it's probably still true, and I don't know why it was cut out. The whole Cainhurst Vileblood thing seems like it was intended to be a lot more significant than what we ended up with. So maybe it was cut out to basically kind of give them a chance to do this storyline better in the DLC. We'll see. But from this you can kind of piece together a really horrible implication of what actually went on at the abandoned workshop. Because if we find the umbilical cord on the altar, and the altar is facing the moon, and we know that the moon presence was beckoned by the umbilical cord, and that the umbilical cord comes from the body of the child of the Vilebloods, and that the altar is covered in blood, then it seems like Lawrence and Gurman and whoever else was in the workshop with them put the child on the altar to summon the moon presence, and then the child died. I don't think that this is an intentional case of child sacrifice, because the whole idea of children luring Great Ones is that Great Ones want surrogate children, and if you killed the child, the Great One obviously would lose its surrogate. But nevertheless, there is so much blood on that altar that it does seem like the child died. So it's possible that they simply realized that the Great Ones were attracted to this particular child, but didn't know why. And remember, this is exactly what Mensis end up doing, only in their case the lure is Murgo. So basically what I'm suggesting is that this back area of the workshop is kind of where everything went wrong for Gurman. He was culpable in the death of a child, and ever since he has been trapped in the hunter's dream. Trapped in this nightmare cycle where it's just hunt after hunt after hunt, and he's just losing his mind. So of course, this area, where everything started to go wrong, he doesn't want anything to do with. He just refuses to acknowledge it and leaves it there to get dusty and fall to pieces and get covered in cobwebs. It's even called the Memory Altar. I mean, we know that's for Carol runes, but there could be a double meaning there. And I'm not done here, because the reference to Mensis and Murgo kind of got the gears turning, and I think I understand what is going on with Lawrence's body. One of the pieces of dialogue you can hear Gurman muttering is,
"Oh, Lawrence, what's taking you so long?"
And that's a really good question, because what is taking Lawrence so long? It seems like Lawrence and Gurman had a plan, in which Gurman is basically just trying to stop the beast plague getting out of control while he waits for Lawrence to get back. But it doesn't tell you where Lawrence went or why. So here's my theory. In order for this to work, we have to assume that the bloodletting beast is Lawrence. The bloodletting beast's original Japanese name is Kemono Chi no Aruji. Now, Kemono means beast, Chi means blood, No is possessive, and Aruji means either host, master, or lord. So putting those together, we end up with the bloodletting beast's original Japanese name being either host, master, or lord of the beast blood. Now, since the entire corrupted blood thing starts when Lawrence leaves Byrgenwerth, the name of the bloodletting beast in Japanese and the skull on the altar and the headless bloodletting beast, to me absolutely, there is no question, the bloodletting beast is Lawrence. There are two chalices where we fight the bloodletting beast. The first bloodletting beast we fight is the one with a head. We fight it in Lower Thumaru, and it drops the defiled chalice. So Lawrence was in the Thumaru Labyrinth, and he had the Defiled Chalice. What does the Defiled Chalice do? It opens up the Cursed Thumerian Defilement, which is the only way to get the Great Thumaru Ihil Chalice. The second boss of the Great Thumaru Ihil Chalice is the Bloodletting Beast again, only it's the headless version. So Lawrence appears to have taken the same route that we did. He's opened up the Cursed Thumerian Defilement and then made it to Great Thumaru Ihil. Then he got decapitated, but that's another video. What I'm interested in is what's at the bottom of Great Thumaru Ihil. It's Queen Yharnam. Very specifically, it's pregnant Queen Yharnam. There are 2 Yharnam models in the game. One is pregnant, one is not. The one who is not pregnant is the one we see in the strange visions of her that we get at Moonside Lake and in the Nightmare of Mensis. This is because she's already given birth to Murgo and Murgo's been stolen. The boss version is pregnant. Her clones aren't, but she is. It's how you tell them apart. So as far as the chalices are concerned, Murgo hasn't been born yet. Lawrence was looking for Murgo. He was looking for another suitable child to recreate the ritual, this time hoping for a different result. Only he died, and Murgo was taken by Mikolash. Gurman doesn't know this has happened because he's trapped in the dream, so he's just left to hold the fort indefinitely. It's not his day. This is going to be more of an addendum to the previous section, as I did discuss quite a bit of Gurman in that. The first thing I want to discuss is the missing leg. It's tempting to say that Gurman lost his leg and that's why he's retired from hunting and now has this kind of advisory position. But the game does hint at a more disturbing explanation. And it hints at it in a way that very, very explicit, but also very, very easy to miss because of how the information is conveyed to you. If you take the Honouring Wishes ending, when it shows you in the wheelchair at the end, you are missing a leg. This is very, very easy to miss because of the angle that the game uses to show you the missing leg. Bloodborne's armor sets just have so much cloth on them, and most of the torso armor has some kind of cape. So it tends to obscure the view. But as you can see here, I've beaten Gurman with Ariana's shoes on. And when we get to the wheelchair ending, yeah, it's gone. It's gone below the shin. The thigh is still there, but this matches exactly the injury that Gurman has. With the one difference being that Gurman's missing his right leg and we're missing our left leg. Since this ending is us taking on Gurman's role, it seems likely that he lost his leg in the same way that we just lost ours, which is that the moon presence seems to have somehow removed it, and this is why we're confined to a wheelchair in the same way that Gurman is. This seems to be a kind of symbolic captivity where we've had a leg removed so we can't run away.
Unshackle me, please. Anybody.
Obviously I say symbolic because, we couldn't escape from the dream anyway. The moon presence has captured us. And also, when we fight Gurman, he's capable of moving around, relatively freely on his prosthetic leg. So it seems more like this is a way for the moon presence to mark us and say, you're under my control now. You're basically a bird that's had its wings clipped so you can't fly away. So I guess Gurman used to be a hunter like us, then he took a great one to the... There's also this odd little quirk where Gurman's model changes when he stands up. People have said that maybe this is kind of Gurman remembering the glory days, this is how he used to dress and how he used to behave, so he sort of becomes his younger self again when he fights you. The problem with that is that he still has the prosthetic leg. Like, you'd think if Gurman were somehow regressing back to his sort of prime that there'd be more of a change, but it just seems to be different clothing. So I think it might just be a mistake. The amount that Gurman knows about the waking world post the dream being conceived is either very revealing or just inconsistent, and I can't tell. I'm specifically thinking of how he knows all about the burning of Old Yharnam.
Yet the town is in disarray. It was burned and abandoned for fear of the scourge. Home now only to beasts.
So, either someone has to have told Gurman that Old Yarnum was burned down, or he has to have been there. If he was there, then that puts the burning of Old Yarnum at a point in time prior to Lawrence summoning the Moon Presence, which is, a very long time in the past. But then the impression you get from Old Yarnum as an area is that the burning of Old Yarnum took place fairly recently. The piles of corpses still have skin on them, and the strung-up bodies are actually still on fire. And, there's that note near Gilbert that mentions the burning of Old Yarnum. So there's two possibilities that I can see. The first is that Gurman's being kept informed of what's going on in the waking world by other people who dream. But in that case, the whole thing where he's worried about Lawrence and Willem doesn't seem to work, since surely he would know about, Lawrence being decapitated and his skull being worshipped in the church, and, he would have heard that Willem had gone insane. The other explanation is that Gurman wasn't initially trapped in the dream as soon as it was created. He may initially have been able to travel between the dream and the waking world in the same way that we do, and his captivity is a more recent thing. The way that Gurman disappears if you attack him is very similar to what happens to Mikolash if you attack him. Mikolash and Gurman both seem to fulfill, very similar roles in their particular dreams. They're both watching over their little areas of the Dreamlands on behalf of their respective organisations. Gurman for the Hunters and Mikolash for Mensis. It's also worth pointing out that in the previous episode I mentioned that Japanese nouns don't always specify if they're singular or plural. So the way Hunter's dream is rendered in English as Hunter '(s), it's a singular Hunter's dream, may not be accurate. It could be the dream of the Hunters as an organisation, in the same way that the nightmare of Mensis belongs collectively to Mensis. This creates a kind of interesting mirror-image relationship between the two. The Hunters have a dream, Mensis have a nightmare. Gurman is trying to continue the work of Lawrence, Mikolash is trying to continue the work of Willem. Both of them used a child to summon a great one, and in both cases it went horribly wrong. Gurman's status as the first hunter suggests something about his relationship with Lawrence. If you look at the item description of Gurman's clothing, it specifies that he started hunting before the workshop had been created, and that he was just improvising with his everyday clothing. So, he really is the first hunter. It's not a title he has, he's not... I've seen people say that he's the first hunter of the dream, but no, he seems to be the actual first hunter. So, going back to what I said in the previous section, what seems to have happened here is that Lawrence's experiments with the old blood somehow unleashed the beast plague. This led to Lawrence entrusting Gurman with the task, basically, of containing it. This seems to be the first hunt, and it's led by Gurman. And it seems that the workshop was established after that. So presumably Gurman didn't have his burial blade at the time. That was crafted later on. Given that, from the little we hear of Lawrence, he seems kind of like he thinks he knows more than everyone else. It's possible that he just did not foresee how bad the Beast Plague would actually be. And, really didn't foresee that he would ultimately need an entire, dedicated organisation just to deal with the beasts. And, I don't know what exactly he's referring to when he says this, but the way that in one of the endings he will say,
"Oh, it doesn't matter. It always comes down to the hunter's helper to clean up after these sorts of messes."
It's almost like he's just been cleaning up messes ever since the whole hunt started. The old blood causes the beast outbreak, Gurman's got to clean it up. Lawrence seems to have completely underestimated how bad the outbreak would be, so Gurman's got to clean that up. Then Lawrence seems to have come up with this plan to contact a Great One, and that hasn't worked out, so Gurman is stuck again in the dream, waiting for Lawrence to come back. And that's never going to happen. And yet, despite all this, he does remain loyal to Lawrence, because when he frees you from the dream, he says,
"Farewell, my keen hunter. Fear the blood."
We also know that, from the description on the Old Hunter's Bone, Gurman had at least one apprentice. And since we find that bone on a grave near the abandoned workshop, it makes sense that that's the grave that Gurman's apprentice is buried in. Beyond them being Gurman's apprentice, I don't think we're supposed to really care who this character was, though, because it specifically says that his name was lost. So, if the name is lost, then it doesn't seem to be anyone that we've heard of. One interesting thing about it, though, is that it specifically says that the quickening, which is the effect that the bone gives you, where you kind of turn into mist and teleport rather than dashing, is a technique particular to the first hunters. This is something that Gurman does during his boss fight, and it obviously makes sense there considering Gurman is the first hunter. But the Bloody Crow of Canehurst also does it. And the Crow can't reasonably have the old hunter's bone with him, because we've got it. So, either the Bloody Crow has another hunter's bone, which would kind of work, since if he's connected to Canehurst, then he'd want to hunt other hunters to get blood dregs. But it's also possible that he's quickening naturally, as the old hunters did, and maybe he is one of the old hunters and he's managed to prolong his life unnaturally through his association with Canehurst. But anyway, back to Gurman's apprentice. His grave is the grave that we find the doll praying at sometimes. And even though there are hundreds and hundreds of graves in the hunter's dream, we only ever see the doll pray at that one, apart from a little Easter egg thing that I'll cover later on. So there is the suggestion there that there is some kind of significant connection between Gurman's apprentice and the doll. And since that grave is present in the waking world, along with the doll, we can fairly safely assume that Gurman's apprentice died before the hunter's dream was created, before Lawrence beckoned the moon presence. Which also means that whatever was going on between Gurman's apprentice and the doll also predates these events. So, at this point, we kind of have to turn to the doll itself. I think it's safe to say that the doll is probably the most opaque and impenetrable major aspect of Bloodborne. There's just been theory after theory after theory as soon as the game came out of what is going on with this thing. That is she possessed by Erden? Is she possessed by the moon presence? Is she built in the image of Gurman's daughter? Is she genuinely as helpful as she seems, or is this all an act and she's manipulating us? I've even seen it argued, without irony, that she's Gurman's sex doll. So I'm going to approach it like this. I will start with everything we know about the doll, which is not much. I will then draw on real-world information from outside of Bloodborne to try to figure out exactly what purpose this doll would serve. I'm then going to try dovetailing those two strands and see if we can get anything comprehensible out of it. These videos have been based on inferences, so we can come up with a hypothesis. But the problem is that we can't use that hypothesis to engage in any further investigation because there's no way to kind of, go to Yharnam and ask Gurman what happened. And short of Miyazaki himself confirming or denying something, or the upcoming Old Hunters DLC confirming or denying something, educated guesses is kind of all we have. So, on to what we know about the doll. Firstly, the doll is very, very tall. I don't think this is trivial, because there are tall NPCs in the game. Gascoigne's a good example. But the doll is like 8 feet tall. Now, she was designed, so whoever designed her has to have either decided to make her 8 feet tall and Miyazaki was okay with that, or Miyazaki told them to make the doll 8 feet tall. Secondly, her hair is grey. It looks grey on the model, and the hair clip specifically says that it's grey. So it's not that she's, a very, very light blonde and it looks weird under whatever lighting they've used. Her hair's grey, but she is otherwise modelled after a very young woman. This is very odd because it's possible for a young person to have white or grey hair, and it's, not unheard of in anime for a young person to have white or grey or silver hair as a way of making them stand out. However, Bloodborne's aesthetic is clearly not anime, it's gothic. Also, no other young characters in this game have grey hair. You have to be approaching Gurman's age for grey hair to be a thing, so the doll's grey hair is very unusual. Thirdly, the doll very specifically has articulated hands. So, whoever built the doll built her to have these articulated hands. They're not a feature of her being animated by whatever has brought her to life. Fourthly, The doll will respond to most of the gestures that we can make with a gesture of her own. Bowing and clapping are quite common. I'm going to do numbers from now on because fifthly sounds weird. Number 5. Whatever the doll's skin is made of is cracking. If you move the camera up very, very close to her, you can see small fractures forming all over her face, in particular around her scalp. This is consistent with just paint cracking given time and it drying out and the thing it's painted on expanding and contracting. So we can safely assume that the doll's face was painted on. 6. The doll is found in the abandoned workshop. She's slumped in a corner near what we come to know as the memory altar. This is not somewhere the doll ever stands when we're in the dream. 7. In her inanimate state, whether in the waking world or the dream, the doll's index finger will move independently. This could imply that even when inanimate, the doll is kind of slowly coming to life. But if the doll was designed as a piece of automata, which the hands seem to indicate, then this could just be a function of her design. 8. The doll in the dream allows us to become stronger by taking our blood echoes. We hold out our hands to her, and she places her hands either side of our wrist as if she's tapping into the vein. This is a kind of reverse version of what happens if you're a vile blood and you start trading blood with Annalise. She will hold out her hand and then we'll make a motion as if we're drinking the blood from her wrist. Also note that we don't trade blood with the doll, we trade blood echoes with the doll.
Honorable Hunter, pursue the echoes of blood. I sense the ancient echoes. They course your veins.
The Japanese name for blood echoes is chi no ishi, which translates to something like the dying wish of the blood. This is more descriptive than simply calling them echoes, but still doesn't really explain what they are. But the point is, this is not blood. Cold blood is blood. So despite what Gurman says,
a workshop where hunters used blood to enhance their weapons and flesh.
That's not what we do, and it doesn't seem to be what the doll was designed for because the one in the waking world doesn't do this. 9. The doll in the abandoned workshop has slightly different descriptions depending on what version of the game you play. The North American version describes her as just a plain doll. If you have the European version, however, it says an abandoned doll. And if you have the Japanese version, it does indeed specify that she was either abandoned or thrown away. So whatever purpose she was designed for, it seems like it's been fulfilled and she's no longer necessary. 10. In contrast to the fact that the doll is now thrown away and abandoned, at some point she was treated with incredible love and care by someone. The description of her hair clip mentions the care with which it was kept, and the description of her clothing mentions that the fine craftsmanship and care borderlines on mania. So someone in the past was utterly obsessed with the doll. 11. The doll prays at the grave of someone who is very likely Gurman's apprentice. This grave is, of course, present in the waking world. So for doll to care specifically about this one grave that predates the hunter's dream implies that she remembers a time before the dream existed. 12. The doll is not unique. Winter lanterns are dolls. Remember that the Dreamlands are a place. They're not a shared hallucination. So when we see the winter lanterns in the nightmare and they look like the doll, that's not us having a weird nightmare where the doll grows a giant brain head and attacks us. Those are actual creatures that would exist whether we were there or not. The question is where they came from. So either Mensis has created something specifically patterned after the doll in the nightmare, or Mensis brought a bunch of dolls with them. That kind of sounds bizarre because surely dolls can't be standard issue equipment, but Mikolash has a thing for animating dolls. I mean, they might be corpses, but they're clearly moving around like they're marionettes on strings. So whether the dolls were either constructed in the nightmare or brought into the nightmare from outside, there is still more than one doll. although we only see evidence that one of them has avoided becoming a winter lantern. It's also worth noting that in the abandoned old workshop we do find a spare set of doll clothes that are explicitly referred to as a spare. And remember, it's exactly the same outfit that the doll wears. And of course it's the same outfit that the winter lanterns wear. So multiple dolls and multiple doll outfits were created. 13. I'm sorry this is going on much longer than I thought it would. The doll's prayer about Flora of the Moon is something that she says when she doesn't think we can hear her. To me, this is the biggest argument against the doll having some kind of sinister or manipulative intentions. Even when we're not around, she's praying for our safety and she's praying that the hunt will end for us. If the doll were in any way malicious, you'd expect these conversations that the player isn't supposed to hear would sound like, the Revolver Ocelot conversations at the end of the Metal Gear Solid games, with the doll secretly reporting our progress to the Great Ones or something, but she just seems to want us to be okay. 14. The doll in the dream cries as an emotive response to a memory she has. The description of her tear states that a doll sheds neither blood nor tears, so its nature remains unknown. For our doll to cry, then, she must be something more than a normal doll. 15. This is the last one, okay, I promise. No matter how many times we kill the doll, she will always come back to life again when we re-enter the dream. But when she comes back, she will act as though this is the first time we've spoken to her in the game. She will explain that she is a doll in the dream to look after us. So she has not died and come back to life again in the way that the player does. She seems to have been reset in a way, although she will still remember her time before the dream, and she talks still about countless hunters visiting the dream. So even though she doesn't seem to recognize us, it's not clear precisely how much she remembers and how much has been forgotten. So that's all the information the game gives us about the doll. And as you can see, we're shown quite a lot of little details about the doll, but bigger questions like why she exists and what she's doing aren't really answered. So before I start making big grand assumptions about her, I'd like to look at dolls in Japanese culture. Firstly because obviously Miyazaki is a Japanese designer working in a Japanese studio. And secondly because dolls and the whole idea of an inanimate object gaining a soul is something that you see a lot of in Japanese culture. Obviously, we have it in the West in things like Pinocchio and arguably Transformers. But, you'll see. In the Japanese script, the doll is only ever referred to as a ningyo, which simply means doll. However, Japanese dolls are divided into a series of different categories that all have their own different name. So the game is not specifying the kind of doll she is, but we can try to figure that out by looking at her design. My initial thought is that she was what's called a karakuri, which is basically an automaton, a doll that's designed to be able to move by itself. These can sometimes be puppets, but some are capable of what appears to be independent movement because they have a series of springs and things inside that can be wound and cause them to move around by themselves. The one that's on screen now is a very famous kind of karakuri that's designed to serve tea to guests. Basically, its movement is dictated by a lever inside it that's connected to its hands. So what happens is when you put something on the tray it's holding, its hands move downward, which triggers it to move forward, and then once you take the thing off the tray, the pressure is released so the hands come up again and that triggers it to move backwards. So it gives the impression that it's like a little butler robot that moves by itself. Other karakuri are designed to perform other actions. Some are very simple, some are very complex. What made me connect the doll to a karakuri? Firstly, it was the hands. Her hands are very, very clearly segmented. So the design has prioritized her being able to move her hands over her hands looking realistic. So prior to her coming to life, she was designed with movement in mind, even if it was just her hands. The second thing, though, is the little gestures she will do if you gesture to her. She'll perform very basic actions like bowing in return and clapping and things like that. These are the kinds of motions that a karakuri would be designed to perform. Obviously, the doll in the dream is animated by some force and she's gesturing of her own volition, but no other NPCs that I'm aware of have this kind of reaction to gestures, and the way that she reacts does seem very almost mechanical. So, if her hands were designed for movement, it's possible the rest of her was as well, and these little gestures she gives us were part of it. This might also explain why she's 8 feet tall, because obviously a larger doll would be easier to build complex mechanisms into. This is probably stretching it though, because I have another explanation for her being so tall that I'll get to later. So I'd say that there is a reasonably good case to be made for the doll being some kind of karakuri. The second kind of doll I want to look at is called the Iki. Iki dolls are designed to be as realistic as possible. So this doesn't fit with the doll having these strange articulated hands, but it does fit with her face, which does look very realistic. The real reason I wanted to talk about Iki with reference to the doll, though, is that one of the most famous Ikis is of a pregnant woman. The abdomen of this Iki can be separated from the rest of the body, and inside you can see various stages of fetal development. Given how important infants are in Bloodborne, and also given that, despite their name, the Healing Church are more like a group of scientists than a religious organization, I wouldn't say it's likely that the doll was some kind of anatomical model. But it did kind of strike me that one of the more famous dolls in Japanese culture is this pregnancy doll. The third and final thing I'd like to talk about isn't about dolls specifically, it's about a folk belief, which is that inanimate objects can develop a life of their own. These are called tsukumogami, and they're something that if you have any kind of interest in Japanese media, you probably are aware of them even if you don't know the name. One of the more common examples is a paper lantern that's become a kind of cyclops face and has a very long tongue. This is called a chochin-obake. Another example is the kasa-obake, which is a possessed self-aware umbrella. You can kind of see where I'm going with this with regards to the doll. Objects will become tsukumogami if they're extremely well cared for and kept in good condition for usually 100 years. In which case they're supernatural, but they're basically benevolent. The other situation that creates tsukumogami is if an object is abandoned, in which case, because it wasn't cared for, it will develop an evil disposition. And the doll is technically both of these. On the one hand, she's treated with incredible care and attention and love by whoever it is that made her and maintained her. But on the other hand, when we find her in the waking world, she's been very unceremoniously abandoned and just dropped in a corner. And what's especially relevant about her abandonment with reference to the way that Japanese culture treats dolls? There is a Japanese custom which is still practiced to this day called the Ningyo Kuyo, which is literally a funeral that's held for unwanted dolls. The idea being that, because a doll is a replica of a person, they should be disposed of with respect rather than just abandoned. And clearly our doll hasn't got that kind of respect. Now, I don't think any of this digression, any of these three things I've talked about, is a satisfactory explanation for the doll on its own. But what I've tried to do here, and also with the beginning observations about the doll, is to provide a kind of context in which the doll can be discussed. So, with all this in mind, I'm now going to start discussing theories about the doll, and whether or not the stuff I've brought in this video would seem to confirm or deny them. The first is the idea that Gehrman is the one who built the doll as a companion. The appeal of this, I think, lies in the description of the blood gem you get from the doll's tear, which paints whoever created the doll as someone very lonely who was looking for a friend. And Gehrman is, of course, a very lonely character living in the dream with no one but the doll. The problem, though, is that Gehrman demonstrates absolutely no affection for the doll. He only ever mentions her once.
You're welcome to use whatever you find. Even the doll, should it please you.
And you'll notice that he says it under his breath in this whispering tone. Like he knows we're going to use the doll, but he doesn't kind of want to acknowledge it. It's almost like on some level he's frightened of her. Likewise, the doll doesn't seem to show any affection for Gehrman.
Did you speak with Gehrman? He was a hunter long, long ago, but now serves only to advise them. He is obscure, unseen in the dreaming world. Still, he stays here, in this dream. Such is his purpose.
It comes across as a strictly professional relationship. There doesn't seem to be any kind of bond there. But to me, the biggest flaw in that argument is that all the contextual clues we have point to it being Gurman's apprentice who built the doll. And even if he didn't build her, he does seem to be the one who lavished all the attention on her. We see her pray at his grave, and yet we never see the doll and Gurman even exchange words. And although Gurman is a very lonely, solitary figure, when we hear him talk in his sleep, it's all about Willem and Lawrence and about his duty to them. He doesn't, cry out for a missing family or anything like that. So I'd say that Gurman building the doll, or having really anything to do with the doll, is very unlikely. There's also the theory that the doll is somehow manipulating the hunter. I sort of addressed this earlier, but basically my problem stems from the doll's prayer. She's praying for us in our absence. She doesn't know that we can hear her, and she specifically wants the dream to foretell a pleasant awakening. Now, the only way that Bloodborne can end with a pleasant awakening is if we choose to submit to Gurman. So the doll doesn't seem to have an ulterior motive. She wants us to do exactly what Gurman wants us to do. She doesn't seem to want us to ascend either. When we do ascend, she's not shocked by it.
Are you cold? Oh, good hunter.
She seems almost amused, actually. But there's no indication that she was pushing us toward that. And also, remember, the doll is quite talkative. Certainly more talkative than Gurman is. And you'd think that if she were manipulating us, if she wanted us to do something, she'd slip that into the dialogue somewhere, but she doesn't. Unlike Gurman, who explicitly says,
Seek a holy chalice. Ascend to Erden Chapel. One of the holy chalices is worshipped in the Valley Hamlet.
Things like that. The doll has no dialogue like that at all, with the exception of this.
Honorable hunter, pursue the echoes of blood.
But as echoes do make us stronger, this is consistent with her just wanting us to be okay. So basically, I just don't see a reason not to take the doll's claim that
I am a doll, here in this dream to look after you.
Completely on face value, because she is a doll, she is in the dream, she does look after us, and none of her behaviour contradicts that. You can make a similar criticism of the theory that the doll is inhabited by Erden. The problem I have basically with all of these doll conspiracy theories is that the doll just acts like it's business as usual the whole time.
Over time, countless hunters have visited this dream.
There's no hint of a master plan or that the doll is working toward anything. Basically, the crux of the whole problem is that what makes our character ascend, what makes our character unique in a way that previous hunters weren't, is the way that we consume the umbilical cords. But that is something that we as a character do independently. The doll does not tell us to go out and do that. Neither does Gurman. Neither does anyone. The closest we get is a note in the lecture theatre. So, while I think there are some hints in the game that our particular hunter is special in some way, this is not something that the doll or Gurman seem aware of. If anything, we seem like the opposite. It seems like this whole situation with the Great Ones and the Hunt and the Dream and the Beast has been going on as a continuous cycle over and over and over again, and what our character does is actually throw a spanner in the works and kind of mess things up. If we choose any ending other than submit to Gurman, it's clear that we very specifically haven't done what people were expecting us to. I'd actually like to broaden this and just say that I don't think the doll is inhabited by anything other than the doll's self. The key thing is, the doll remembers things from before she was animated. She prays at the grave of someone who, it appears, built her. If we give her the hair clip, she remembers and she starts crying. If we were talking to an alien intelligence inside the doll, then it wouldn't remember any of this. I think that, again, we just have to take the doll at face value. She is a doll, and somehow she is alive. This is precisely why I brought up the whole Tsukumogami thing, because there is a precedent for this kind of stuff in Japanese folklore. She's just a doll. The question is, what kind of doll, and why do they have a doll? I now want to talk about the doll physically, because one of the theories I've seen is that she's based on somebody important, presumably to Gurman, who died, either his wife or his daughter, and the doll was constructed in their memory. As I've already said, I'm not terribly convinced that Gurman really had anything to do with the doll to begin with. But to me, the big problem is just that the doll is 8 feet tall and has grey hair. It's hard to imagine her being based on anyone human, but she could be based on someone who isn't human. Although what follows is not an exact match, I think it's worth dwelling on. And that's that what differentiates a Pthumerian from a human is that Pthumerians are much taller, they have very pale skin, and they have very pale hair. They also have very dark, very deep-set eye sockets, which the doll doesn't have physically, but she has so much makeup around her eyes that it does kind of give that impression. But equally, there are a lot of Pthumerian traits that she doesn't have. While her skin is pale, it's not the same kind of bluish pale that we get with the Pthumerians. Pthumerians also have very, very pronounced cheekbones, which the doll doesn't have. So she appears to be kind of half human, half Pthumerian. Or a vile blood. Well, we don't see Queen Annalise's face. Her skin and hair are extremely pale, like a Pthumerian. But the portraits around Canehurst and the look of the ghosts there suggest that the people there looked reasonably human. And if she is somehow based on Annalise, then that might explain the similarity between exchanging blood dregs and exchanging echoes. Even though they're not technically part of the Hunter's Dream, we do need to start addressing the Winter Lanterns. I think there might be something in applying the Tsukumogami explanation to the lanterns as well. If our doll was the original, and she was treated with incredible care and respect by her creator, then that could be why she has a benevolent nature in the dream. The lanterns, however, don't. Although one of the problems with discussing the Winter Lanterns is that it's not clear if the lantern is one single creature, a doll that has grown a huge brain and gone crazy, or if the brain has just kind of taken over an inanimate body. I'm tending toward the first explanation there, purely because if you kill a Winter Lantern in melee, as part of its dying animation it will reach its hand out. So a humanoid form does seem to come naturally to it. So if these dolls were treated without love and without affection and without care, then that would explain why, within the dream, they're hostile. They've risen as a hostile Tsukumogami. And there's an interesting little theory in that, because if these dolls were made by Mensis, then given the time frame, they would have been made long after the original doll was. So when I talked about there being multiple dolls earlier, it could be that there was one original doll crafted by Gurman's apprentice, and then Mensis, in their attempts to recreate whatever Lawrence did to summon the moon presence, for whatever reason decided to copy the doll's design. So this would give us one doll that was crafted with incredible care and attention by a craftsman who loved her, followed by a dozen what are basically bootleg dolls, made by people who perhaps don't really understand why the doll is special, and this ultimately reflects on the forms they take in the dream. And if that's a rough analogue to what's going on, then the singing that the lanterns do would be a function of the doll. And, I mean, the Mensis brain, which the lanterns' heads seem to be related to, doesn't ever sing. So it does seem to be that the singing is coming from the doll. Now, I made a video a while ago, and it was the first video that ever got any attention, so statistically you've probably seen it. And in that I did a mashup of the Winter Lanterns singing with Lullaby for Murgo. And it seemed to me that the lanterns were singing Lullaby for Murgo, but in a kind of slow, off-key way. This recently got some attention on Reddit, and a user called Oracular Duck, who knows a lot about music, did a breakdown of the humming and Lullaby for Murgo, looking at the actual notes and the structure, and came to the conclusion that basically the songs are very similar, but they're not the same song. In terms of the notes used and the structure of the songs, they fit very nicely together if you mash them up like I did, but they are still two different pieces of music. And knowing nothing about music theory myself, I'm not going to bother challenging Oracular Duck on that. So I'm not going to argue that they're actually singing Lullaby for Murgo. But they are still singing, and what they're singing does appear to actually be a piece of music. It's not just warbling and humming. And it's odd that our doll doesn't sing. So I'm going to leave this hanging for a bit and bring up something else about the lanterns and the doll. And that's that both of them are situated in areas where a child has been used to summon a great one. Obviously here I'm considering the Nightmare Frontier and the Nightmare of Mensis to be basically the same area, which I think is fair enough, because you can see the Nightmare of Mensis from the Nightmare Frontier, and both locations are connected via the lecture hall. The significance, though, isn't just that they have this thing in common, it's that the doll is very, very motherly. By which I mean she's a kind of creepily perfect mother figure. She's completely selfless, she only cares about other people, she's completely self-sacrificing. She doesn't seem to want anything outside of making things better for us. Even when we're not there, she's praying for us. We know that when great ones lose their children, they yearn for a surrogate. But in order for a child to become a surrogate, it has to lose its mother. So wouldn't the child want a surrogate of its own? And, while the idea of Gurman and Lawrence in a 3 Men and a Baby style comedy situation has potential, realistically it's kind of a non-starter. So could the doll have been constructed with the intent of providing a substitute mother for the vile-blood child that Lawrence and Gurman sacrificed to summon the moon presence? And the dolls that Mensis have were designed to fulfill the same function with Murgo? Because really, the big problem with Murgo is the crying. The baby sound effect that we hear after hitting a certain insight threshold, or when the blood moon rises, is Murgo. It's not just a creepy sound effect. And you can test this, because after beating the wet nurse, in which we either rescue Murgo or Murgo dies. I tend to think that we rescued him, but that's another video. If you don't then immediately head to the fight with Gurman and just go hang around Yharnam for a while, you won't hear the baby cry again. Or at least I didn't hear it when I sat there for about 20 minutes testing this. The point is, that crying is Murgo. It's Murgo crying out in distress from the nightmare where he or she is held captive. And Murgo is crying out for Yharnam. And as we see, Yharnam is able to follow this crying all the way to the Nightmare of Mensis. And I think it's kind of clear that Mensis don't want anyone else in the nightmare, particularly a pissed-off Thumerian monarch. And of course, the most pragmatic way to stop a baby crying is that you sing them a lullaby. It's called a lullaby because it lulls you into sleep. And the game obviously has a song that is very specifically called Lullaby for Murgo. And Yharnam herself does not sing this song. It's actually only found in Gascoigne's music box. So while the song itself may not be a human composition, humans do at least know it. And they have a vested interest in keeping Murgo quiet. And this music seems to be part of that. And even if the Winter Lanterns aren't singing specifically Lullaby for Murgo, they're still singing something. These creatures here certainly imply that Mensis were creating some kind of, at least a nanny for Murgo. So whether or not that makes the doll as a surrogate mother more or less likely is up to you. It's not inconceivable that a similar situation happened at the original workshop. If Lawrence had stolen the child of the Vileblood Queen, it would likely also be crying for her. And while we never get a real taste for the Vileblood Queen's powers, she is at the very least immortal. And presumably she had control over the Knights of Cainhurst well before the castle fell into ruin. So again, someone that if you piss them off, you don't want them to know your address. So what I think may have happened, and this is entirely speculation, but I think it does provide a neat resolution, is that the original doll was created in the image of the Vileblood Queen as a substitute mother for the child of the Vileblood Queen, so that after Lawrence took it to use in the ritual to summon the moon presence, the child would not be crying. And if the doll were designed to rock the child to sleep, to hold the child, to possibly feed the child, then that would explain why she has these articulated hands. And then when whatever happens at the workshop goes horribly wrong, The doll is just discarded. But she comes to life in the dream as an idealized, benevolent spirit because that's what her creator thought of her as. Mensis then come along however many years later and attempt to do the same thing. And they must realize that in order for this to work, they will need a doll to shut up Murgo. So they create their own dolls. And these ones are designed to sing. But then, when everything goes horribly wrong in the Nightmare of Mensis, their dolls, being metaphorically and literally soulless copies of the original, rather than becoming benevolent, mothering spirits, instead become whatever this is. There's obviously a lot of speculation in that, but it is, to me, the most complete theory that I can come up with. It might also explain Gurman's apprentice's obsession. If Lawrence went to Canehurst, then this apprentice might have gone with him, and either fallen in love with or just been bewitched by the Vileblood Queen. So when it came time to make a doll of her, his obsession was projected onto the doll. And if she came to life in the image that he gave her, then that would explain why Trading Echoes looks like we're trading blood dregs. She's a nice Vileblood. But ultimately, unless the old hunters drop some kind of major revelation on us, which it might well do, we'll just have to accept that her nature remains unknown. Well, the night and the video were long. Before this ends, I just want to talk about why I didn't mention this. Basically, in case anyone doesn't know, what happens is, if you choose Submit to Gurman, you'll see the doll pray at your gravestone in the ending sequence. And then when you go into New Game Plus, you'll see that that grave is still there. And the doll will sometimes be seen praying at it in the way that she prays at the grave of Gurman's apprentice. The thing is that this doesn't make sense, and there's no way you can make sense of it in a way that's consistent with the rest of the game world. It's a little Easter egg that the developers left, but it's not... The thing is that New Game Plus plays out identically to our first playthrough. Which means, characters that died are alive again. The Menses ritual hasn't happened yet. People don't recognize us. So really, the only way you could make sense of something like this would be to say that the whole game works like Groundhog Day. Which is, it's unlikely. So I didn't really talk about it. Oh, what else? With regard to scheduling, I'm trying to knock out as many of these as I can before The Old Hunters comes out. Because basically I'd just like to, for the sake of consistency, have the base game covered in as much detail as possible, and then address The Old Hunters separately, to see if it confirms or disproves anything. So I'll probably up my release frequency, which I should be able to do because I've finished recording everything. Although, having said that, I've thought I've finished recording everything at least 12 times by now. Next up, I'm interested in doing another enemy analysis video. This time on the beasts that we find around Yharnam, just to see if everyone turns into a unique beast, or if the beasts are somehow related to each other, and whether it works like Pokemon. So I will see you later.